Everyone, this is Utkarshini Gupta. I hope I am audible to everyone. This is Utkarshini Gupta, lead content writer at AESC. I welcome you all to this webinar. And to clarify to everyone, this is a recorded meeting, and I request you all to turn your mics on mute. And people who create any kind of disturbance or any kind of nuisance will be excluded from this meeting. So, to begin with, I will introduce our club first. That is AESC. It is AMU Economics Student Club. It was established in 2021 by our seniors, and it is led by enthusiastic undergraduate students of economics from Aligarh Muslim University itself. And it is our distinct honor to introduce Professor K.C. Adaina, an esteemed expert in the field of environmental valuation. He is currently a professor at Azim Premji University, Bangalore, and he is also a program coordinator at Masters of Arts, that is MA Economics, at Azim Premji University. And if anybody of you wants to take admission at APU and have any type of queries, you can ask him. He would be the best person for that. Moving on, he has a PhD in economics from the prestigious institute of IIT Madras. He has dedicated his career to advocating for plural forms of value articulations. His pioneering works include constructing a multidimensional framework for assessing the non-use values of the environment. He has numerous articles widely published on the platforms like Deccan Herald, The Wire, The Hindustan Times, etc. Some of his articles are based on green growth, loss and damage, and various other fields. His arena does not only lies in economics but beyond that as well. Currently, he is engaged in groundbreaking research on just transition towards renewable energy, traditional ecological knowledge, and sustainability. So it is our honor that today he will lead us in exploring the pivotal question that can economists save the planet from the climate catastrophe? So please join me in welcoming Professor K.C. Adaina sir to begin this webinar with his intelligence. Thank you. Sir, please carry on.
Thank you, Utkarshini. Thank you very much for your very generous and warm introduction. It was much more than what I am, but thank you for your very kind introduction on that. I also want to warmly welcome all of you. It's a great honor and um, a pleasure for me to be here to talk a little bit about what I feel about economics of climate change. I'm not sure if I can really substantially change or contribute to your understanding of the economics of climate change, but whatever little views that I am expressing this evening is purely my own personal assessment of what are the strengths, the prospects, and limitations of economics as a discipline in sort of trying to explain a physical phenomenon like climate change. How far can we go there, and what are some of the limitations of a discipline like economics? So let me just share my screen to all of you. So I hope my screen is visible to all of you.
Yes, sir, it is.
All right. So I hope to take maybe about 30 minutes of some kind of an introductory remarks, and then I think we can open it up for Q&A and further our discussion on this. So the first question that I would like to pose everyone is, why should an economist or students of economics be interested in a physical phenomena like climate change? So I'm not sure if you have a course on economics of climate change or environmental economics there in your university. If
So
you
we have.
do, or you do have.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
It
that's
is elective course.
Oh, I see. I see. That's wonderful. That's wonderful to know. So, which means that a lot many of you would be familiar with many of the terminologies, and I think we can sort of pitch our discussion at a certain level in that case. And it's very nice to know that you have a course on this. Nevertheless, I want to maybe throw in a slightly different viewpoint, maybe, which is that it's important for students of economics to uh, deal with issues of climate change, because if you really think about it, climate change can be viewed as a fundamentally economic problem. So one tends to think that a physical phenomenon like climate change is for the natural scientists, for the pure scientists, right? For chemical scientists, maybe, because they know the chemical composition, they know the atmospheric composition of air. Climate change as such is a very physical phenomena. Why should economists or students of economics be interested in this kind of a physical phenomenon? That's the kind of tendency that we normally have, right? So when there's a a manifestation of climate change in terms of, let's say, extreme weather events, right? Like floods or droughts, or that claims a lot of lives, for example, uh, most people, including policymakers, would not typically think of inviting economists to talk about it, to discuss about it. Why is this happening, or what could be the way out of this kind of extreme weather events that we're beginning to face a lot more rapidly, with much greater frequency in our country and also across the world. So what I'm saying is, layperson alike, policymakers alike, it is very unlikely that when there are manifestations of climate change, economists are rarely invited, right? Economists are not the first point of contact to really come in and talk about, what really happened and what could be the way out. But I'm saying, from within the discipline, from the perspective of an economist, uh, we are sort of able to clearly see why climate change is happening. Like for us, as students of economics, we are very clear that climate change is a fundamentally economic problem. Why is it an economic problem? Is because uh, emission of greenhouse gases have no economic value. Right? We're not pricing carbon. We don't put a price to carbon, and therefore there's a tendency to freely overproduce because we're not putting a price on carbon. Right? So, and this really takes us back to our theory of externality in microeconomics that you would have learned. But I'm just uh, sort of going to quickly take you back to that uh, theory of externality, negative externality, and why there's always a tendency for overproduction to happen, right? Especially when we're talking of uh, public bads, or in a goods market, which tends to have negative externality. There's always the tendency to produce more or to overproduce than the socially desirable level of output. Right? As you can see in the graph here, so if you're talking about, this could be any industry or any firm that you can think about, but the output of that firm, if it's an iron and steel industry, for example, the output, every additional unit of output here will have a certain associated externality with it, isn't it? So if you really talk about the market determined uh, price and output level, you could see that the market determination of the equilibrium price and output is where the demand curve intersects the supply curve, which represents the private marginal cost of production. So left to itself, we know very clearly that the marginal cost of production does not include the external cost to the society, right? Which is the amount of pollution, amount of waste that these firms are generating. Only if we force the private firms to recognize the amount of externality can we begin to really think about the social cost of production. And as you can see, if there are external agencies, if there are governments, if there are regulators, if there are ways to penalize these firms to and force them to recognize the kind of externality that their production process entails for the environment and also for human well-being, only to the point where we are able to force them to recognize the external cause, and we begin to imagine a new cost line here, which is the social cost of production. Can we find a new equilibrium point here? And you can see that the production level actually falls. So, what am I essentially saying here? I'm saying that climate change is of interest to economists because here is a case where there's a certain overproduction of um, a good or a service with an associated level of pollution. And unless we put a price to it, and there are different ways to think about pricing carbon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a while. But what I'm saying is that the discipline of economics does provide with certain analytical tools to understand and try and capture the extent of that externality and put a price to it, right? So that we're able to arrive at a more socially optimum level of output. So I'm saying that economics is a very interesting discipline on one hand, because it does provide us with very interesting ways to understand why certain physical phenomena like climate change is happening, what are the kind of tools that are in our disposal to try and address this kind of a market failure at the global scale. Right? So that's there on one hand. Nature of an environmental uh, degradation like climate change at the global scale, my suspicion is that economics in itself may not be enough, or the way we understand economics today. And when I say economics today, I'm not talking about economics as we understand it I'm saying that those tools may not be sufficient enough to deal with issues of climate change. Why? Because climate change has this very unique set of attributes which make standard economic analysis very difficult to apply. One, that climate change is a global problem which requires unprecedented international cooperation. And you know that cooperation is not easy to come by. Right? We have all kinds of game theoretic model, if you remember. For example, prisoner's dilemma as one of the game theoretic model, which really highlights to us the impossibility of arriving at a certain decision metrics where the payoff would be maximum for all parties involved. Right? So if you think about different countries as different players in a game, and different countries are trying to respond to other countries' decision cut down on carbon or not, right? What would be my country's best response to your country's decision to either cut carbon emission or not, right? That kind of a structure is something that I'm assuming you are familiar with, and this is a typical game theoretic model to sort of understand different countries' response or best response, right, to other countries' decision to cut emissions or not. And I'm bringing up this point essentially to let you know that cooperation is very difficult to arrive at, very difficult to come by. As this uh, two by two matrix prisoner's dilemma game is telling us, you can see there are two countries here, country A and country B. What is the objective here? The objective is to cut down on carbon emission or not. What are the strategies for emission reductions? What are the payoffs involved in that? Okay. Now the payoff would be largely in contingent upon two things. So the payoff is in terms of one, the cost of cutting down the carbon emission, okay, which is the cost of controlling carbon emission. So that's one of the payoff, one of the components of payoff. The second component of payoff would be in terms of the benefits that would accrue to your country or the neighboring country if there was carbon emission reduction. So, what would be the foregone damages to agricultural output? What would be the foregone impact of climate change that would have disrupted our economic lives, economic activities? Would be one of the components of payoff, is what I'm saying. So, if you look at these numbers 50, 50, 60, minus 40, and so on, I'm saying how did we arrive at 50? This payoff 50 is composite of two items. Right? Let me just quickly uh, repeat that again. One is that this payoff is coming from uh, one is coming from the net avoided damages because of carbon emission reductions. Okay, and the other aspect of that payoff. So a bit of that payoff would now be reduced because you also have to invest on carbon emission reduction strategies. So your payoff would have been pretty high, but there's going to be a slight reduction in that because you're going to be investing. There's a certain marginal cost of um, abatement there, right? There's a marginal cost to abating carbon emission. For reducing carbon emission, it costs your country, right? So the other one is I think quite clear. Uh, the avoided damages minus the cost that each country have to invest in cutting emission, right? So I hope the payoff structure is clear to all of you. We have two countries here and they have two strategies, as you can see, whether to cut carbon emissions or not, right? So we can start with country A's actions in response to country B's actions, right? So if country B decides to cut emission, should country A also cut emission or not? As you can see in all the four payoff that you can see here, parenthesis, you realize that this is what would be the socially desirable or the payoff that or the option that maximizes the payoff for both countries, right? Because both countries are receiving 50-50. This would have been the most ideal payoff structure, is what I'm saying, which means that both countries decide to cut carbon emissions. But the point is, if country B decides to cut emission, will country A decide to cut emission or not cut emission? As you can see, if you compare the two payoffs for country A in response to country B's decision to cut emissions, you realize that 60 is greater than 50 here, right? Which means that the payoff for country A is higher if country A decide not to engage in carbon emission reduction strategy. Okay, so that's one way to interpret that. Now, if you look at country B's other actions, which is if country B decide not to cut, should country A cut emissions or should country also not cut emissions? Again, if you look at this, what should country A's response be to country B's decision to cut emissions? So as you can see here, uh, that if country A decides to cut emission, while country B decide not to cut emission, the payoff for country A is minus 40, which is not a good thing. But if country A also decide not to cut, the payoff is minus 30, which is less than minus 40. So what are we seeing here? We are seeing a certain response strategy of country A, isn't it? What is the dominant response strategy here? Which is that in this case, irrespective of what country B does, whether country B decides to cut emission or not cut emission, the best response for country A is to not cut emission. Because irrespective of what country B does, if country A do not cut emission, 60 is greater than 50, so it's good for country A. Minus 30 is better than minus 40, so country A will not cut emission. Right? The same logic holds good. Uh, uh, vice versa for country B's response to country A's decision to cut or not to cut. Right? So uh, we will realize that for country B as well, the dominant strategy would be not to cut. Right? If country A decides to cut, and if country B decide not to cut, you see the payoff for country B, which is 60, is greater than 50. That's good for country B. So why should country B cut emission? Right? So it would not engage in that. Now look at the second option for country A. If country A decide not to cut emissions, what should be the response of the country B? Right? So if country B cuts, then the payoff would be minus 40. If country B decides not to cut, the payoff would be minus 30. Right? If you compare minus 30 with minus 40, minus 30 is a better payoff for country B. So likewise, whatever country A does, whether it cuts or not cut emissions, country B is much better positioned to not cut emissions. Right? So then what happens? Both countries will end up in this quadrant here, right? Which is to not cut and have a payoff which is negative 30 for both countries. Now, all of us know that this is the most ideal outcome, and yet it is so difficult to arrive there. And we're talking about, of course, this is a static game, it's a one time static prisoner's dilemma game. Repeated games can probably increase the outcome a little better, depending on the kind of trust level between two countries. But here we're just talking about two countries. Think about as many countries that are available in this world and how much more difficult it is going to be to sort of arrive at a meaningful cooperative strategy which will uh, maximize the payoff for all parties involved in this kind of a game theoretic response to its other countries decision to cut or not to cut emissions. So, why I bring this up is because uh, beyond a certain point, one becomes very wary, isn't it? Despite the fact that international conventions and treaties on climate change have begun way back in early 80s or late 70s, and we are now in 2023, we are still not really able to effectively and collectively arrive at collective actions to drastically reduce carbon emission. I think there are many scientific reports, including the Stern Review and also various reports from IPCC, various rounds. And scientists are very clear about the fact that the global warming needs to be restrained or restricted to within about 1.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. But we are not really able to cap global warming within that range, right? Given the business as usual scenario of carbon emissions. So I'm saying that despite this more than about 3 decades or 3.5 decades of international conventions and treaties, we're going to have the Conference of Party again just now. uh, Despite all of these conference of parties, we are really not able to find a space where cooperation is meaningfully uh, arrived at in a way that would aggressively put us and all the countries towards certain pathways where we are aggressively engaging in emissions reductions. As you all know by now, this cooperation is also complicated because of the fact that we have this large disparity between the global north and global south. Right? There's that debate between global north and global south, which is also to do with the fact that global north is comprised of much more developed industrialized countries. Global south, referring to countries including India, Brazil, and many other rapidly developing economies for whom economic growth is the main priority, and because of which we need to uh, emit a lot of carbon. Whereas global north have already grown in terms of their economy, and they're only sort of developing. So I really like that distinction between growth and development in that sense, where many of the industrialized countries, in terms of economic growth, if you look at their growth rates of their GDP, it's not very high. You'll find that the growth rates of GDP are about 1.7 to 2.5, 3, and so on. Whereas rapidly emerging and developing countries like India, our growth rates tends to be much higher, and that is expected because we are at the developing or growing phase. And so for us, we really need to engage in a lot of industrial activities. Manufacturing sector occupies a key strategic position in our economic structure, uh, as as it does in many other developing economies, right? So for us, there's the need to continue to emit a lot, whereas for the developed countries, they don't need to emit as much anymore. And then the developing countries are sort of asking the developed countries to be cognizant of the fact that they have been polluting for the last 250 years or so, right? Starting the onset of industrial revolution. And as you all know by now, what is particularly dangerous about carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas is really the fact that um, uh, carbon dioxide has a very long lifespan, which is that if you emit CO2 today, it remains in the atmosphere for very long period of time, more than a century. So, which is what the developing countries are really arguing and say, you have already industrialized, you have been polluting the environment for this many decades. And what you have done with the onset of industrial revolution is what we are now experiencing as a repercussion of your industrial activities then, right? So you can't really point fingers at the developing country and say you have to cut down on emissions. So you see, there are many of these economic and political reasons why cooperation is sort of complicated even further, right? Than what a game theoretic model like prisoner's dilemma as it is predicts for us. The second reason that I want to emphasize on is on why economics may not be enough is that climate change is uh, pervaded by uncertainty in every step of the process of translating global emission into local damages. Again, if you look at some of the economic tools and policy instruments to deal with this kind of a conflict or negative externality or deal with any kind of market failure, you would remember the contribution by economist Ronald Coase, and you know about quotient bargaining, and how, for example, it is a very useful and a neat uh, proposition to deal with conflicts and to come out of a certain market failure. Uh, but what happens is that for quotient framework to work, there's a requirement for very well defined property rights, isn't it? So if you remember the quotient bargaining framework, he says that transaction costs should be minimum or zero, and that property rights should be well defined. Now, um, what really happens here is that it is very difficult to institute property rights. Right? It's difficult to say, okay, the airspace above me is my property. Right? It's not like putting a fencing or a wall around the plot of land that you have. If you have a garden, it's much more easy to sort of fence the garden around and say, this is my property. But it's not so easy to do that on let's say the atmospheric space above us. So the neighboring uh, district or the state, for example, can engage in polluting activities, and I could be the victim of that. So if you remember the kind of conflict that really arises in a country, particularly in winter season, for example, starting around late October or mid October to December, January, in Delhi particularly, is always to do with this problem of stubble burning. right? And of course, we have politicized as much as we can, but also there's also elements of truth about the fact that there's a lot of stubble burning in the state of Punjab, particularly, and also in Haryana. And so the polluting activities happen in a different state, right? But the victim of that, the impact of that is felt by citizens of another state elsewhere. So what I'm saying is it's therefore very difficult to uh, institute a very well-defined property right, right? And say that this is our property, and whatever you're doing is exerting negative externality for us. Okay? So I think this is a very unique feature of the environment, which is that it's very difficult to institute well-defined property rights. Uh, think about a chemical industry and the kind of a toxic chemical waste that they would have dumped into a um, nearby water body, and think about how the toxicity would seep into the groundwater table, as such that people living or community living in the vicinity of that chemical farm, for example, when they draw up water, obviously their water will also have that toxic content with them. But what I'm saying, it's going to be very difficult for you to say that the land or the groundwater under my land is mine, it's my property, right? And whatever you're doing elsewhere there is sort of getting my groundwater table is contaminated by what you are doing elsewhere there. So what I'm saying is the airspace above us and whatever is the geosphere below us, very difficult for us to establish property rights. Right? So what I'm saying is, even though economists at different points of time have tried to come up with different ways to sort of resolve conflicts and problems of market failure and problems of negative externality, uh, it looks very neat in terms of a model. When it's time to sort of practically implement it out, it's a lot more easier said than done. Also, the other point about quotient bargaining is the assumption of transaction cost being minimal or zero, but you know that that's really not the case. When it comes to problems of carbon emission, you know that the transaction cost is going to be very high, right? Just to file a case against a polluting firm is going to cost you quite a bit, right? Because you have to hire a lot of people who are experts, who are chemical experts, who can sort of establish the fact that the firm is producing this kind of greenhouse gas. Is it CO2? Is it SO2? Is it NOx? And to what extent? What is the concentration of that? So you need all of the scientists to sort of gather those data information to sort of even file a case against another firm. Right? You need to sort of invite a lawyer, employ a lawyer to fight for you. So you have all kinds of transaction costs that would be high enough and that would deter you from even pursuing filing a case in the first place. What am I saying? I'm saying that if we draw a graph, just like this graph, for example, it does look kind of neat and clean and say, okay, it's just a matter of recognizing that there's a social cost and the vertical distance between the private cost and the social cost is really that externality, right? Is the external cost. And we tend to say, well, if we are able to pin down the extent of that externality, we can put a price to it, and then the conflict is resolved. So what I'm saying is, in the graph, it does look very neat and nice, right? In reality, it's not so neat. It's not so easy to put a price to an externality. Right? Think about toxic chemicals uh, in either water body or in the air, and let's say the community in the vicinity of that chemical industry is absorbing or taking in a lot of that toxicity, and it results in some kind of deformity, for example. How are you going to put a price on that, on the health implication of absorbing or taking in those toxic chemical content? It's not going to be easy, isn't it? I mean, how do you put a price to your health? I mean, economists will always come up with proxies and say, okay, what is the medical bill, medical consultancy charge, hospitalization charge, and so on. Right? But those are just proxy. I don't think neither you nor me would be sort of happy or willing to put a price to the health condition that you and I have. So we have all of those limiting cases, what I'm saying. What is the other reason why one would be skeptical about the tools that economics provide? Is that the cost and benefits of mitigating climate change. If we have to mitigate climate change and say, okay, well, let's start cutting down on carbon emission, who's going to bear the cost of cutting down emission, and who is going to be the beneficiary of that, right? This is a very difficult political economy question once again, because the costs and benefits of climate mitigation are heavily mismatched, right? Both in terms of geography as well as temporally. So as I was saying, because of the process of and the difficulty in translating global emission into local damages, there's that geographical mismatch of uh, ascribing costs and benefits of climate mitigation on one hand. On the other hand, there's also the temporal dimension to it, which is the time dimension to it. Right? So, what is the argument provided by Nicholas Stern and William Nordhaus? If you remember, the famous debate between them is really on the discount rates. So, what should be the ideal discount rate depends on who should bear the cost of climate mitigation, which includes people like you and me, because we are currently living in this generation, um, vis-a-vis what would be the benefits that would be accrued to future generation if we were to aggressively pursue climate mitigation today. So if we cut down on carbon emission today, it means we have to cut down on a lot of economic activities, which could mean that's going to start affecting our income level. Our consumption expenditure is going to fall. So it has a lot of trickle down effects on the current generation. So what you would otherwise invest on, for example, social welfare schemes, social security schemes, uh, enriching the welfare of the community or citizens of the country, instead of doing that, you're investing on, let's say, newer technology, better technology that reduces carbon emission, because you're thinking about future generation. So when you have to practically decide on uh, how much of the cost should be borne by the generation today, or by which country, geographically or temporarily, by this generation vis-a-vis the forthcoming generation, and who should enjoy the benefits of the costs that we are sort of incurring today, is a very difficult question to ask, right? So economics does provide us with some interesting tools and talk about, let's say, discount rates and social discount rates, with two stellar climate economists, throwing very different numbers on what should be the social discount rates and so on. The very fact that the discount rates itself are very different here, provided by these two economists, means that it's not easy to really arrive at this. So we can keep on debating and keep on talking about this, right? While climate change continues to happen. Uh, the last aspect that I want to talk about is this aspect of uncertainty and irreversibility. So once climate change happens, the thing about climate change, and or generally about ecological change or environmental change, is that it is marked by non-linear change, right? So there are this very unpredictable spikes uh, in environmental changes. So if you trigger a change somewhere, we cannot really model, we cannot really predict what kind of ripple effect is going to create elsewhere, right? So you're inducing a change to a particular ecosystem, but you do not know what kind of uh, uh, ripple effect is going to trigger in other ecosystems around. And also the fact that the moment you trigger a change beyond a certain threshold level, there's going to be the notion of irreversible change. So if you think about global warming, and because of which there's a lot of glacier melting, there's going to be a point beyond which we will not be able to maintain the planet's climate uh, similar to the amount of ice clad mountain that we have because of the rapid erosion or rapid melting of glaciers, right? It's going to be unpredictable, is what I'm saying. And of course, physics as a discipline also provides us with very interesting concepts of feedback loops. Some of you who are doing economics of climate change would have talked and discussed about negative feedback loops, positive feedback loops, and why positive feedback loops are extremely, extremely dangerous to play with. Right? Because a positive change like global warming uh, creates a much faster rate of glacier melting. But because there's a positive change in glacier melting, in the next cycle, you're going to absorb a lot more heat, right? Because they have a lot of surface land area that is exposed. It's going to absorb a lot more heat, leading to much higher global warming. And because in the second round, the global warming is much higher, the glacier melting rate is going to go up much higher. And that positive feedback, once you put that engine into place, it is going to be extremely dangerous. Right? So, whatever models that we can think of, whatever predictive models that we can think of, we are able to model a lot of risk. We can do a lot of risk analysis in stock markets, in insurance markets, and so on. Uncertainty is something that is extremely difficult to be modeled. Okay, just want to put that out. Um, I do not know how we're doing in terms of time. Yeah, I think the next 5 minutes or so, I'll try to quickly cover the remaining few points. Um, so we started off by saying that economists should be interested in the issue of climate change because uh, of the fact that we are not pricing carbon, there's overproduction of carbon, right, leading to global warming and so on and so forth. But again, that's a lot easier said than done because pricing carbon is not going to be easy. It is a heavily contested, complicated exercise to put a price on carbon. So, if you look at the Stern Review in Economics of Climate Change, which was released in 2006, they used the approach or the method of social cost of carbon to price carbon. Right? What is social cost of carbon? Social cost of carbon is really the economic value of the damage caused by extra ton of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So for every extra additional ton of greenhouse gas that you emit, what is the economic value of the damage that we impose on the environment? Is the social cost of carbon. So that was the metric for carbon pricing in the initial Stern review. But the updated economic modeling did tell us that there's something not right about using social cost of carbon as the approach for pricing because of the high level of uncertainty that we were just talking about. Right? So if you look at the definition of social cost of carbon here, look at this: the economic value of the damage cost to the atmosphere. Right? So this is a extremely utilitarian kind of an understanding towards value, right? Because those of you, again, if you have done environmental economics, you might have been aware about the different types of environmental values. You have concepts of use values, non-use values, and so on, right? And if you look at different cultures and community across the world and how they relate to the environment around them, there are different ways and different eco-philosophical worldviews that different communities hold in a way that the way they understand and articulate environmental value is uh, so different, and it can't be fit into the utility function that a typical economist would employ. Right? So think about the holiness of Ganga River, for example. Think about the sacred groves. Think about many tribal or indigenous communities who holds a very personal relationship and a deep sense of sentimental attachment to a particular environmental entity, like a river, a mountain, where their sense of identity itself comes from the existence of that mountain or from that river. Right? So the way you value environment is very different, is what I'm saying. That's one. The other thing is really to do with the kind of uncertainty. So the damage that we inflict on particular ecosystem, like I was saying, could really trigger ripple effects, right? So if you have heard about butterfly effect, which is a metaphor used to talk about this level of uncertainty and yeah, irreversibility, or the regime shift that ecologists are talking about, right? Which is that if a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere very far off, in the eastern coast in US, for example, we're talking of that flapping of butterfly wings causing a typhoon or a tornado somewhere in China, for example. Right? So of course, doesn't happen that way, but that's an anecdote, that's a metaphor to indicate the kind of uncertainty. That's the anecdote to indicate the kind of spikes, the unpredictable spikes that could happen if we tamper with ecosystem functions beyond a certain point. So what am I saying? I'm saying that pricing carbon is not easy. It used to be social cost of carbon. Now that has been replaced by a new approach on the basis of uh, marginal cost of uh, carbon emission reduction. Right? So they're saying that what would be more appropriate would be the cost of cutting extra ton of emission, which is what I was telling you as one of the components of payoff in the prisoner's dilemma game theoretic approach just a while back. So, what are we saying? Putting a price is a very complicated, challenging task. So, this part, I don't think I'll be speaking about it, um, but maybe during Q&A, if there's something related to any of this, I'll try and bring up some of those. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to stop here. Again, I want to thank all of you for your patient listening and for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of my thought on climate change. And if you have queries and questions, I think I'll be happy to address some of them.
First of all, sir, thank you for enlightening us. And me being a student of environmental economics, I was really like it really helped me to understand the concept that were taught to me in class. So it was really wonderful. So I would like others to ask questions. If you want to open your mic and ask the questions, you can, or either you can comment your questions in the chat box. Either way would work. So you can come up with your questions. So we do have our first question. I'll read it. Uh, which are the institutes in India which offer MSc Economics and PhD Economics in specialization with environmental and sustainability? Should I repeat it?
Utkarshini, I think I got it. I got it. Thank you.
Okay, 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 sir.
So Muhammad Umar, thanks for your question. What comes to my mind first is first and foremost is the Madras School of Economics. Madras School of Economics is a school of excellence, specialized in the field of environmental economics and economics of sustainability. So if you take a look at their website, I think they have about 5 different types of master's program uh, dealing with different aspects of environment. So they also have economics of climate change separately, environmental economics separately, sustainability science, I think, if I remember correctly, separately, all offered by economics professor. At the same time, they also have a very interesting, rigorous PhD program there in Madras School of Economics. I think that is one place that, if one is serious about pursuing environmental economics, you should really think about that. Terry in Delhi is another option that comes to my mind. Otherwise, you can really look up at various IITs. IIT Delhi has some faculty that I know who are closely working on issues of environment or environmental economics. IIT Madras has a lot. IIT Guwahati also has. Likewise, you can think of some of these premier institutes. Even IGIDR, if I remember correctly, uh, NIT Bombay. Uh, these are some of the institutions that immediately comes to my mind. You also have the Institute of Economic Growth in DU campus, isn't it? So that is a very prominent institute that produces a lot of scholarly works on in the field of environment and economics.
So we have, thank you, sir. So we have the next question by Shagupta Ansari. Sir, how carbon border tax is impacting countries like India?
Um, so I'm trying to better understand the question. Um, could you clarify carbon border tax?
Shagupta, if you are there, you can please clarify it in the comment section, or you want to speak so you can turn on your mic and clarify your question a bit more.
My assumption is that Ansari is probably hinting at carbon tax in itself. Maybe border is just an additional word that's there. But I think the larger question is, how would carbon market or carbon trading um, affect a country like India? So yeah, Ansari, I'm not particularly sure of the carbon border tax mechanism. I am aware of the emissions trading scheme that European Union has come up with. Maybe a newer format to that might be the carbon border tax mechanism. Um, yeah, I think so. I have not been teaching this paper for quite some time, so I'm losing touch with the newer terminologies for that. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I think I vaguely remember carbon border tax mechanism. That's right. Um, but I don't want to respond unless I'm very sure of that. If it's the carbon trading, carbon taxation itself, then yes, it has clear implications for countries like India. But something to do with the word border, I just can't put my finger to it anymore right now at this point. I'll try and get back to you on that.
So Alfia has next question.
Audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
How climate catastrophe hinder the progress of the individual nation?
Right. So, thank you, Alfia. It's an interesting question. So, if you think about a tropical country like India, um, when we say climate change, let's be very clear that it's not a temporary, short term weather change. We're talking of a long run change in weather patterns. Right? So, weather, the word weather is typically a short run phenomena. Climate change is a much more sustained long run phenomenon. What we're beginning to see over the last many years is that in many tropical countries, particularly, we are beginning to experience a lot of extreme weather patterns, as they call it, which is that sometimes if it rains really, really heavily. It pours down. You have some kind of a cloud burst kind of an experience. The sort that happened in Sikkim just few weeks back. I think it may not be wrong to attribute that to an aspect of climate change, right? So think of a cloud burst like that completely shatters the entire community. You've seen how many people lost their lives, how much of properties got damaged, how the dam itself burst because of that. Or if you think about heat wave and how many people lost their lives because of not being able to adapt to extreme heat wave, or how increase in temperature really affects agricultural productivity. Right? For an agrarian economy like India, think about how climate change and temperature change or precipitation change can really affect agricultural productivity. Right? It can really result in not just the loss of agricultural productivity, but also agricultural workers themselves. Right? So whenever there's monsoonal failures or there's extreme drought or flood, think of the amount of damage both to properties, assets, and also to different agricultural crops and what it means for agrarian economy like India. So that's for a country like India. I mean, you can think about many other countries, many other low-lying countries, Maldives, for example. Think about low-lying country like Maldives. What would be the response, or what should be the adequate response of such a dangerously low-lying country like Maldives? So now I think there are many interesting propositions about global citizenship, for example, right? Which is that Maldives, because of the threat of sea level rise and the threat of submergence of the country, is talking about being relocated, right? The citizens being relocated to other different countries, to safer countries. But the point is, which country is willing to accept citizens of Maldives into their country? Right? So we have to really think about new concepts like environmental refugees. So when you hear the word refugee, generally or conventionally, what comes to our mind is maybe civil war in Syria, for example, or in Iran or Iraq or Middle East or Ukraine and Russia. So and then you tend to think of the word refugee uh, closely associated with war. Today we are talking about environmental refugees. Right? Environmental refugees, the fact that you are displaced from your country, or you have the potential to be displaced and relocated from your country because of the threat of climate change. So then we have concepts like global citizenship, which is that uh, you are free to go and live in any country. You have the global citizenship in that sense. Right? You're not an Indian citizen, American citizen. You should be given global citizenship. I mean, none of this have really been materialized, but I'm sort of highlighting the kind of discourses that are happening around the world to deal with issues of climate change like this.
Thank you. What, as an economist, what initiative we can take to shift the economy from the non-resources to a renewable one?
Yeah, I think uh, for a question like that, I think the political will is really, really important. So I think we really need to bring in political economy kind of a response to this. So there are many uh, huge, large industrial magnates who doesn't want the country or the system to switch to renewable energy because they're benefiting a lot from the fossil fuel industry, right? They are very well established companies already in fossil fuel industry, and they're going to lose so much if the country as a whole switch to renewable or sources of energy. So, so there's a lot of lobbying that happens under the carpet in order to slow down the process to transition towards renewable energy. There's a lot of that that's happening on one hand. On the other hand, I think as students of economics, we should be very clear about the cost and benefit analysis of transitioning from fossil based economy to a renewable based economy. As it is, I mean, the sustainable development goal has within itself the requirement for all countries to transition towards renewable energy economy. That's there. So in pursuit of that, in any case, we should be trying to transition towards that. But particularly from economics point of view, we should really be interested to know about the cost and benefit of transitioning from fossil based to renewable based economy. So which means that we have to really fight for um, subsidy. We have to really fight for government tax concessions towards companies who are sort of installing solar paneling or windmills or uh, windmills either in the mountain or in coastal areas. So think about some of this renewable technology, but which are quite expensive. So if you remember the concept of positive externality, where in positive externality, the goods and services are underproduced because it generates a lot of public benefit, right? So wherever there's that underproduction of what is considered good for the general public is what needs to be subsidized, right? Is what needs a lot of tax concessions and tax breaks, for example. So as students, I think we can really think about some of those policy instruments arising from microeconomic theory.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Next question. Muhammad Abdullah has raised his hand.
Hello, sir.
Hi, hi. All right.
Hello. How are you, sir?
I'm all right. Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, I was asking that why not India shift to nuclear energy? Because it is one of the most feasible source of producing energy, and we have also seen many countries which are using nuclear energy. So why don't India shift? It could be a feasible option for India because we have to cater a very big population.
That's right. I think that has a lot more to do with humanitarian concern than anything else. Economics uh,